The painters were being nice. Those drooping lips, the wandering eyes, that jaw jutting forward like a challenge to gravity itself, that was the flattering version. When Diego Velázquez positioned his brush before Philip IV in the 1620s, he softened it. When Juan Carreño de Miranda painted the child king Charles II decades later, he gave the boy a dignity his contemporaries would have struggled to recognize. The portraits that hang today in the Prado, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum, in royal collections across Europe, they're diplomatic documents disguised as art. What the Habsburgs actually looked like was something else entirely. The written record tells a different story. Ambassadors from foreign courts, unburdened by the need to flatter, described what they actually observed. When the French ambassador looked upon young Charles II of Spain in the 1660s, he didn't see the composed, melancholic prince of the official portraits. He saw a child who couldn't walk until he was nearly 7 years old, who couldn't speak comprehensible words until he was 4, whose head had grown so disproportionately large that his cranial bones had failed to fuse properly by age 3. The ambassador saw a boy whose tongue was so swollen, the Spanish called it trabado, locked, that he could barely chew his own food, who drooled constantly, who showed what contemporaries delicately termed little interest in his surroundings. This was the product of 200 years of deliberate policy, not Habsburg policy alone, church policy. And that's what we need to talk about. Because here's the thing everyone gets wrong about the Habsburg story. We treat it like a curiosity. Look at the weird jaw. Isn't genetics fascinating? But we're missing the point entirely. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't ignorance. It was a transaction. Every single one of those consanguineous marriages, the uncle-niece unions, the cousin marriages, the genetic concentration that produced Charles II, required a permission slip, a formal document from Rome, a papal dispensation that said, "We know this violates canon law, but we're making an exception. For you. For a price." The Catholic Church didn't just permit the destruction of the Habsburg bloodline. They licensed it, repeatedly, for over 2 centuries. And they did it knowing full well what inbreeding does to offspring. How do we know they knew? Because they owned horses. The dispensation system wasn't some informal process of royal requests and papal favors. It was a machine, bureaucratic, systematic, with paperwork, fees, canonical procedures, and institutional memory stretching back centuries. Canon law had prohibited marriages between relatives since the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. The rules were explicit. You couldn't marry anyone within the 4th degree of consanguinity. Your common ancestor had to be at least your great-great-grandparents. Violate this, and your marriage was invalid in the eyes of God. But the law contained a crucial feature. It could be dispensed. The Pope, as supreme authority in canon law, possessed the power to grant exceptions. This power was absolute. It couldn't be appealed, and it was routinely exercised, for a price. Here's how it worked. A monarch seeking to marry a close relative would submit a formal petition to Rome, typically through an ambassador or designated agent at the papal court. The petition would explain the political necessity of the match, argue for its spiritual benefits to Christendom, and, though the records are often circumspect on this point, would be accompanied by what the Council of Trent delicately termed contributions for chancery expenses. The Council of Trent, meeting from 1545 to 1563, had officially decreed that dispensations should be granted free of all charges. Yet the same council authorized diocesan chanceries to collect modest fees for administrative costs. The contradiction was built into the system from the start. In practice, the distinction between a prohibited payment and an acceptable expense proved extraordinarily flexible. The papal bureaucracy, centered on the Dietaria Apostolica, the office that processed dispensation requests, developed an elaborate fee structure that everyone understood, but nobody publicly acknowledged. The complexity of the case, the degree of consanguinity involved, the wealth of the petitioner, all of these factors influenced the administrative costs. For royal marriages, the stakes were highest, and so were the payments. The papal document authorizing Philip II's marriage to his niece Anna of Austria was, as historians who've examined the records note, accompanied by substantial payments. The Church's own archives document the financial arrangements. This wasn't corruption hidden in shadows. It was administrative procedure conducted in daylight, dressed in the language of charitable contributions and pious donations. The Habsburgs understood the system perfectly. When they needed a dispensation, they didn't simply ask, they negotiated. They sent ambassadors skilled in the delicate art of Roman politics. They offered political concessions alongside monetary ones. They bundled their requests with promises of military support, ecclesiastical appointments favorable to papal allies, and territorial arrangements that served Roman interests. The dispensation wasn't a religious determination. It was a deal. That's the clinical framing. Let me translate. The Church sold permission slips for incest, and the Habsburgs were their best customers. The precedent was set in 1469. Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who unified Spain and launched the Reconquista, were second cousins, close enough to require a papal dispensation for their marriage. Pope Sixtus IV granted it. Not immediately. There was actually a false dispensation circulated first to let the wedding proceed while negotiations continued. But eventually, the real permission came through. The pattern was established right there. Political alliance first, canonical blessing second. The Church would find a way to accommodate power. This marriage, though consanguineous, was comparatively distant. Second cousins share only about 3% of their DNA. Not ideal, but not catastrophic. What followed would be far worse. On July 8, 1545, a boy was born who should have ended the Habsburg marriage strategy forever. His name was Carlos, Prince of Asturias. His father was Philip II. His mother was Maria Manuela of Portugal, Philip's first cousin once removed. A consanguineous marriage blessed by the Church, sealed with a dispensation. Maria Manuela died 4 days after giving birth. First warning. But the true cost of this papal-approved union would only become apparent as Carlos grew. The child who emerged from this blessed marriage was not merely sickly, he was catastrophically damaged. Contemporary accounts describe a young man prone to violent rages so severe that he once tried to stab a servant. He tortured animals for pleasure. His physical form was twisted. Contemporaries noted his hunched shoulders, his difficulty walking, his face that already showed traces of the Habsburg jaw. And there were signs of what we would now recognize as severe intellectual disability, possible psychosis. The Spanish court tried to manage him. They gave him tutors who reported back to Philip II with increasingly alarming accounts. They assigned servants who learned to watch for the warning signs of his rages. They attempted to educate him in the duties of kingship, a futile effort, given that he could barely control his own impulses. This was the heir to the greatest empire on earth. The man who would one day rule Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, Milan, vast territories in the Americas. And he was torturing animals and attacking servants. The Spanish court watched this prince deteriorate through his adolescence and into his early 20s. Royal physicians examined him, treated his recurring illnesses, documented his violent outbursts. They reported to a father who grew increasingly desperate. By 1567, rumors swirled that Carlos was plotting against his own father, possibly conspiring with the rebellious Netherlands, possibly planning violence. On January 18, 1568, Philip II made a decision that no father should have to make. He had his own son arrested. Carlos was confined to his chambers in the royal palace, cut off from the world, left to spiral further into whatever madness had claimed him. 6 months later, in July 1568, Don Carlos died at the age of 23. The exact cause remains historically contested. Some sources suggest illness, exacerbated by alternating self-starvation and binge eating. Others hint at darker possibilities. The rumors of poisoning were never proven, never entirely dispelled either. What isn't contested is the meaning of this death. A consanguineous marriage blessed by the Church had produced an heir so damaged that his own father imprisoned him, and allowed or caused his death. The dispensation that authorized the union between Philip and Maria Manuela had created this tragedy. The physicians who attended Carlos had documented his decline. The ambassadors who observed the Spanish court had reported on his condition to their home governments. Everyone knew what had happened. The evidence was buried in the Escorial. Its implications were impossible to ignore, and now we arrive at the moment that damns the Church forever. Don Carlos died in July 1568. The Church's response came 18 months later. In 1569, Philip II, the same Philip II who had just watched his first consanguineous marriage produce a mad, violent, damaged heir, who had to be imprisoned and left to die, began negotiating for a new wife. Not a distant relation this time, not even a first cousin. Philip sought to marry Anna of Austria, who was his niece. Her mother, Maria of Spain, was Philip's own sister. This wasn't merely consanguineous marriage. This was as close to incest as canon law could possibly permit. Uncle and niece, the same bloodline folded back on itself. The petition went to Rome. Pope Pius V received the request, knowing exactly what the previous consanguineous marriage had produced. The news of Don Carlos's imprisonment and death had spread across Europe. The diplomatic reports had circulated. The Catholic world knew that Philip II's cousin marriage had created a monster. And now the same man was asking for permission to marry even more closely, his own sister's daughter. Pius V, according to the historical record, had serious reservations. An uncle-niece marriage pushed against the outer boundaries of what could be dispensed. The degrees of consanguinity involved were severe. The canonical questions were legitimate, and the evidence of what close Habsburg marriages produced was fresh, literally buried just 18 months earlier. But here's what happened next. He granted the permission anyway. The document survives in the Austrian State Archive. Its language exposes the transaction with brutal clarity. The Pope explicitly stated that he expected the marriage to confirm and strengthen the real Catholic Church and the expected indivisible alliance of Christian kings and rulers. There it is, in writing. The Pope traded a dispensation for political alliance, with full knowledge of what the previous dispensation had produced. The marriage contract was signed in Madrid on January 24, 1570. A proxy wedding was held at Prague Castle on May 4, 1570. Philip II and Anna of Austria were married in person in the chapel of the Alcazar of Segovia on November 14, 1570. The Church had spoken. The dispensation had been paid for, and the fact that Philip's previous consanguineous marriage had produced a child so damaged he had to be locked away and left to die? That fact meant nothing. The timing illuminates everything. The dispensation came in 1570. In 1571, Pope Pius V would organize the Holy League, the grand alliance of Catholic powers that would defeat the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto on October 7, 1571. Philip II was the League's most important participant. His half-brother, John of Austria, commanded the Allied fleet. The Pope needed Philip. Philip needed the Pope's blessing for his dynastic plans. The dispensation was currency in a political transaction. Don Carlos's twisted body was still fresh in the royal crypt, and already the Church had blessed the next generation of concentrated bloodlines. Now let's address the defense of ignorance, because someone will try it. Someone always does. They didn't understand genetics. They didn't know what inbreeding really did. This was before Mendel, before Darwin, before anyone understood how heredity actually worked. How could they have known? They knew. Here's how we know they knew. Horse breeders across Europe understood that breeding too closely within family lines produced weak, deformed, and sickly foals. The practice of outcrossing, bringing in unrelated bloodlines to strengthen a breed, was standard procedure in the stables of every major European court, including the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs themselves. The Spanish riding school in Vienna, founded in 1572, 2 years after Philip married his niece, was dedicated to the Lipizzan horses that the Habsburgs cultivated with careful attention to bloodlines. The school maintained meticulous pedigree records. They tracked which stallions had sired which foals. They knew which lines were becoming too concentrated. They deliberately introduced outside blood to prevent the defects that inbreeding caused. This wasn't theoretical knowledge locked away in dusty manuscripts. This was practical expertise applied daily in the royal stables. The same Habsburg court that approved uncle-niece marriages for its children employed stable masters who would never have permitted the equivalent in their horses. Think about that for a moment. The Habsburgs valued their Lipizzans too much to inbreed them. Agricultural treatises of the period discussed the dangers of breeding livestock too closely. Dog breeders, falconers, and farmers. They all understood through practical experience what modern genetics would later explain. Close relatives share recessive traits. Offspring of close relatives are more likely to express the defects those traits carry. Every farmer in Europe knew this. Every shepherd who managed a flock understood that you didn't breed a ram to his daughters indefinitely. Every peasant who kept pigs grasped that the runts kept getting smaller if you didn't bring in new blood. The knowledge wasn't hidden. It was everywhere. And the Habsburgs applied it religiously to their animals. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. The same courts that approved uncle-niece marriages for political convenience would have dismissed any suggestion of breeding a champion mare to her own sire as obvious folly. The royal stables maintained those meticulous pedigree records precisely to avoid the defects that close breeding caused. Meanwhile, the royal nurseries filled with children whose pedigrees showed the same dangerous concentration. Nobody applied the lesson. When Pius V hesitated before approving the 1570 dispensation, his serious reservations reveal awareness. Something was wrong with this request. He knew it. He approved it anyway. The nuncios who traveled from Rome to Madrid passed through lands where every farmer understood inbreeding and livestock. They delivered dispensations to courts where the stables practiced outcrossing. They carried permissions that the royal physicians would later find written in the bodies of suffering children. The evidence of what the dispensation machine produced lies not in abstract statistics, but in the bodies of those children. The Spanish Habsburg kings from 1527 to 1661 sired 34 legitimate children. 10 of them, 29%, died before their first birthday. 17 of them, 50%, died before their 10th birthday. These mortality rates were, as researchers have documented, significantly higher than the average for Spain at that time. This wasn't the general tragedy of pre-modern childhood. when all children faced high mortality. This was something specific to this bloodline, something targeted, something created. Consider the children who simply disappeared, their brief lives recorded only in baptismal and burial records, the infantes who lived for weeks, the infantas who succumbed to childhood illnesses that their immune systems couldn't fight, the stillbirths that left only entries in parish registers. The physicians who attended these births and deaths kept records. They documented the malformations, the weaknesses, the failures to thrive. They watched the same patterns repeat across generations, each generation worse than the last. The progression was measurable. Philip I, who founded the Spanish Habsburg line, had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.025, already elevated, not catastrophic. His great-great-grandson, Philip IV, had a coefficient roughly double that. And Philip IV's son? The product of that uncle-niece marriage to Mariana of Austria, his coefficient reached 0.254. In 4 generations, the Habsburgs had concentrated their bloodline tenfold. Every dispensation that passed through Rome had set this in motion. Every permission slip signed by a pope created the conditions for tiny coffins. Philip IV married his niece Mariana of Austria in 1649. She was 14. He was 44. And she wasn't merely his cousin. She was the daughter of his sister Maria Anna of Spain and Emperor Ferdinand III. The Church approved this union without hesitation. The dispensation was granted. The wedding was celebrated. The fact that this marriage combined multiple lines of consanguineous descent, that Mariana was Philip's niece through one parent and his cousin through complex overlapping ancestry through the other, raised no canonical objection. The machine processed the paperwork. The fees were collected. The seals were affixed. By this point, the pattern was undeniable. From 1516 to 1649, over 80% of marriages within the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty were consanguineous. 9 of 11 marriages during this period were between relatives within the third cousin degree or closer. Every single one required papal approval. Every single one received it. This wasn't an occasional exception to canonical rules. This was a systematic program of inbreeding, enabled, blessed, and repeatedly authorized by the institutional church. And the Spanish branch wasn't alone. The Austrian Habsburgs, the other major line of the dynasty, followed the same pattern. Emperor Ferdinand III, who married Maria Anna of Spain, was himself the product of consanguineous unions. His marriage to Philip IV's sister continued the concentration. When their daughter Mariana then married her uncle Philip IV, the lines folded back upon themselves in ways that made the family tree look less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. The Austrian branch would later produce its own uncle-niece marriages. Emperor Leopold I, who reigned from 1658 to 1705, married his own niece, Margaret Teresa of Spain, the daughter of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Another dispensation, another approval, another generation of concentration. The pattern was pan-European. Wherever the Habsburgs ruled, Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, the Church blessed their inward-turning marriages. The dispensation machine operated across borders, across decades, across mounting evidence of its consequences. All of these threads, the dispensations, the portraits, the nursery deaths, the institutional complicity, converge in a single figure. Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He was born on November 6, 1661, the only surviving son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were cousins. His family tree didn't branch so much as fold back upon itself. When geneticists later calculated his inbreeding coefficient, They arrived at 0.254. That's equivalent to being the offspring of a brother and sister. The dispensation for his parents' marriage had been granted. The church had blessed the union, and now the church would witness what that blessing had wrought. Charles couldn't walk until he was nearly 7 years old, couldn't speak intelligibly until he was 4. His head had grown so large relative to his body that his cranial bones hadn't fused properly by age 3, a condition that would have killed lesser children. He was described by contemporaries as weak. That word fails completely. He could barely chew food because of the deformity of his jaw and the swelling of his tongue. He drooled constantly. He suffered from chronic and episodic diarrhea. He had frequent pulmonary infections. His lungs were later described as corroded. His skin erupted in herpetic rashes on both cheeks. Late in life, he developed seizures. The court's response to his condition reveals the theological blindness that made his existence possible in the first place. Rather than acknowledge the obvious, that generations of blessed inbreeding had produced a broken child, they concluded he must be bewitched, cursed, possessed by demons. The treatments followed that logic. Charles II was subjected to repeated exorcisms. Priests prayed over his body. Holy water was applied. Demons were commanded to depart. The church that had signed the dispensations creating his condition now sent its clergy to pray away the consequences. When the exorcisms failed, as they inevitably did, the court physicians turned to the medical wisdom of their era. They placed freshly killed pigeons on his head, believing the warm entrails would draw out evil humors. They fed him potions. They bled him. They tried everything that 17th century medicine and superstition could devise. Nothing worked. Because nothing could work. Charles wasn't bewitched. He was inbred. The church had signed the dispensation that created him. Now the church's priests performed exorcisms to cure what the church's permissions had caused. The circularity was complete. Charles married twice. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, died in 1689 after 10 years of marriage without producing an heir. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, fared no better. Charles was completely sterile, his body incapable of producing the children that the dynasty so desperately needed. For 39 years, Europe watched the last Spanish Habsburg deteriorate. Every throne in Europe calculated, every diplomat assessed. When Charles died, not if, but when, there would be no heir. The greatest empire on earth would need a new master. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700. He was 38 years old. The autopsy that followed was conducted by physicians who finally saw, laid bare, what 2 centuries of papal-approved consanguinity had produced. They opened the body of the last Spanish Habsburg and found a catalogue of horrors. His intestines were described as gangrenous and rotten. His lungs, already noted as corroded during his life, had deteriorated further. His heart, when examined, was found to be shriveled to a fraction of its expected size. The physicians noted that his body contained only a single atrophied testicle, the anatomical explanation for his lifelong sterility. This was the final evidence. The church's blessed marriages had produced a man whose internal organs had never developed properly, whose reproductive capacity had been eliminated, whose entire body was a monument to genetic destruction. Charles left no children, no direct heir, and a will that would set Europe on fire. The War of Spanish Succession began within months. It would last 13 years. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, England, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, Savoy. Nearly every major power was dragged into a conflict that killed perhaps 500,000 soldiers. All of this because one king was sterile. All of this because the church had blessed the marriages that made him sterile. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 carved up the Spanish Empire like a carcass. Spain lost Gibraltar to Britain, still British territory today, over 300 years later. Spain lost Minorca. Spain lost the Spanish Netherlands, which passed to the Austrian Habsburgs. Spain lost Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia. Spain lost Milan. The empire that Charles V had ruled, the empire on which the sun never set, was dismembered because its last king couldn't produce an heir. The geopolitical collapse of Spanish power traces directly back to the dispensation machine. Every permission slip that Rome issued contributed to the genetic concentration that left Charles unable to produce an heir. The political catastrophe was biological first. The Pope who blessed Philip IV's marriage to his niece in 1649 couldn't have predicted the Treaty of Utrecht, but he could have predicted what uncle-niece marriage does to offspring. Every farmer in his jurisdiction could have told him. Here's what makes this different from ancient history. The institution that blessed these marriages still exists. It still claims moral authority, still issues pronouncements on family, marriage, reproduction, still presents itself as a guardian of human dignity and sacred life. No apology has ever been issued for the Habsburg dispensations. No acknowledgement that the Church knowingly participated in creating children who would suffer. The evidence isn't just in the historical record. It's visible. Today, modern Habsburg descendants still carry the jaw. The genetic signature of those papal-approved unions persists in living faces. Photographs from the 20th and 21st centuries show the same characteristic prognathism, the jutting lower jaw, the elongated face that Velázquez softened in his portraits 400 years ago. Researchers have studied living Habsburg descendants. They've traced the physical markers through generations. The jaw that defined a dynasty and doomed it still appears in family photographs. The evidence walks among us. This isn't ancient curiosity. This is ongoing consequence. The Church made a choice. Repeatedly, for 200 years. They knew inbreeding was dangerous. Every farmer knew it. Every horse breeder knew it. Every stable hand in Europe understood that you don't breed relatives too closely. And the Church watched Don Carlos descend into violent madness. Watched the nurseries fill with sickly children. Watched the infant mortality rates climb generation after generation. Then they signed the next dispensation, and the next, and the next. The portraits were flattering. The reality was horror. And the institution that enabled that horror, blessed it, profited from it, facilitated it for political gain, still stands. Still claims the right to lecture the rest of us on morality. The case remains open. Subscribe for more stories like this.